Thank you so much for clicking on this video and joining us here at Students Online. Before we jump into the message, I want to encourage you, don't just let this be another video that you let roll in the background while you sit on your phone playing games, but instead, sit up, be attentive, listen, because I truly believe that God's got something to tell us through this message today. Thanks for joining us. Thank you so much for joining us here at Students Online. We're super glad that you're here. I want to remind you that this series is super heavily based around discussion and really talking out what it is that we're learning here. So I want to encourage you that there's going to be some points throughout this message where I'm going to throw some questions up on the screen. Feel free to pause me, think about them if you're kind of just hanging out by yourself. But I really want to encourage you, go grab your parent, go grab some siblings, sit down, watch this message together, because we're really exploring our doubts and some of our doubts and questions that we have about Christianity and how it is that we handle that. And if you were with us last week, you remember that we established that we are not alone in our questions, that all of us have had questions about God, about Christianity, even going so far back as to look at believers in the Bible who had questions about God. So, I want to encourage you, go grab somebody, let's watch this together, and let's learn what it is that God's going to teach us here in this series, Doubt It. I remember my grandfather is a huge fisherman, and in his living room, or excuse me, in his dining room, there is on the wall a huge catfish hanging up on the wall. And every time we go over to my grandfather's house, he tells a different story about how it is that he caught that fish. And it seems to get more and more and more elaborate each time, to the point that I don't even remember how he actually caught the fish, but at this point, I think he was fighting a kraken, and he pulled it out of its mouth or something like that. Whatever it is, it's been shrouded in so much embellishment at this point that it almost doesn't even really matter. But if you've ever hung out with a fisherman, or if you yourself are a fisherman, you always know, oh, I had a fish on the line, it was this big, or I had a fish on the line, it was this big, and it's generally about as big as you can stretch your arms out. And my question to those people every time I'm with them is, well, where's the fish? And of course, every time it's, oh, the fish got away, got off the line broke, or something to that effect. And I go, okay, well, if you don't have any evidence or proof of this fish, I don't believe that you ever really caught it. I think it's reasonable to want to see evidence, to want to see proof of something. I love watching detective shows like 2020. Because they always show both sides of the story, right? They'll start with the defendant's side of the story, and they'll talk about kind of how it is that they went through the situation. Maybe the cops had it out for them, or someone mishandled some evidence, and they're completely innocent. But then maybe they'll cut to the police officer's side of the story and the detective's side of the story as they're looking for evidence and uncovering more evidence and maybe discovering the truth of the situation. And it's really interesting because maybe you formulate your opinion based on whoever's side you start on, but as they unveil and show more evidence, more proof of the truth, you learn the truth, right? You learn what's actually happened. In nearly every area of our lives, investigating, fact-checking, searching for evidence is oftentimes not just reasonable, right? It's celebrated, it's expected to seek out the truth, to seek out evidence. But it seems like when it comes to our faith that if you have doubts, if you have questions, if you investigate, if you seek out evidence, that not only is it just looked down upon, it's sometimes even shamed. That you say that, hey, if you ask questions, it means that you don't have faith. Remember last week we said that so oftentimes we tend to think that faith means just blindly following whatever it is that we are told, when in reality, faith means that we are pursuing God in the midst of our questions, in the midst of our doubts. Having faith in God doesn't mean that we can't also have evidence that supports what we believe. And today we're going to continue this conversation about doubts and questions. And remember last week we said that you're not alone in your questions. And this week what I want to look at is talking more about our questions and specifically how God responds to the questions that we ask. And how God responds to the ask and the request for evidence before it is that we choose to believe what it is that we believe. And today, I want to take a look at Gideon. And in Judges chapter 6, where we're going to be reading from, during this time, the Israelites were being persecuted by, and they were being oppressed by the nation of Midian. Yes, I understand. Our protagonist's name is Gideon. Our antagonist's name is Midian. It's going to get a little confusing, but bear with me. So Gideon is an Israelite, and his people, right, his countrymen are being oppressed by the Midianites. And so the people begin to cry out to God and say, God, where are you? We need help. Please, God, save us. And so an angel of the Lord comes down and appears in front of Midian and basically says, you're going to be the hero. You're going to save the day. I'm going to use you. And in Judges chapter 6, verse 12, we read this: when the angel of the Lord appeared to Midian, he said, the Lord is with you, mighty warrior. Pardon me, my lord, Gideon replied. But if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? Where are all his wonders that our ancestors told us about when they said, did not the Lord bring us up out of Egypt? But now the Lord has abandoned us and given us to the hand of Midian. And the Lord turned to him and said, go in the strength you have and save Israel out of Midian's hand. Am I not sending you? Gideon again says, pardon me, my Lord. But how can I save Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my family. And the Lord said, I will be with you, and you will strike down all the Midianites, leaving none alive. And Gideon replied, if I have found favor in your eyes, give me a sign that it is really you. Please do not go away until I come back and bring my offerings and set it before you. And so we see that Gideon starts to prepare an offering, and he places it on the altar, right? And in verse 21, we see that the angel of the Lord touched the meat and the unleavened bread with the tip of his staff that was in his hand. Fire flared from the rock, consuming the meat and bread, and the angel of the Lord disappeared. And when Gideon realized that it was the angel of the Lord, he exclaimed, alas, sovereign God, I have seen the angel of the Lord face to face. So Gideon gets his proof. Gideon gets his evidence. It is God that I'm actually speaking to right here. Oh my goodness. But he's still not entirely convinced that God's going to do exactly what it is that he said he was going to do. I'm not sure, Gideon's thinking, if God's really going to use me to defeat the Midianites. And so he asks for just a little bit more evidence. And in verse 36, we read this: Gideon said to God, if you will save Israel by my hand, as you've promised, look, I'll place a fleece wool, a blanket on the threshing floor. If there is dew only on the fleece, and all the ground is dry, then I will know that you will save Israel by my hand, as you asked. And that is what happened. Gideon rose early the next day. He squeezed the fleece and wrung out the dew, a bowl full of water. And Gideon said to God, do not be angry with me. Let me make just one more request. Allow me one more test with the fleece, but this time make the fleece dry and let the ground be covered with dew. And that night God did so. Only the fleece was dry. All the ground was covered in dew. This story might be kind of shocking or kind of confusing, right? If you've grown up in the church, or if you've been a Christian for a while, or you actually don't even have to be a Christian to understand, if you've ever been told that, hey, if you had faith, or if you were a good Christian, or if you really wanted to pursue God, you wouldn't need this evidence. You wouldn't be asking God all these questions. You wouldn't be asking God to show you anything. The story might be kind of shocking or kind of confusing if you've been shamed for your questions or shamed for asking God for evidence. Look, when our questions are directed towards God, like in Gideon's case, as we can see, God doesn't get angry with us. In fact, it seems like God is actually pretty understanding. So take a minute, talk about these questions. Do you agree with or relate with Gideon wanting to see some proof? And do you think that God always gives evidence as clearly as he did specifically in Gideon's story? And when might we ask God for evidence today? And finally, what might it mean if we ask God for evidence and we don't receive exactly what we're asking or exactly what we're expecting? So we've talked about Gideon, and what I want to look at is another character, another figure in the Bible who's actually often used as an example of not having faith. So much so to the point that he's earned himself the nickname of Doubting Thomas. And in John chapter 20, verse 24, we read this. Now Thomas was one of the 12. He was not with the disciples when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands, and put my finger where the nails were, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe." A week later, his disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them. Though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." And he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here. See my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe." Thomas said to him, "My Lord and my God." Then Jesus told him, "Because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen me and yet have believed." So here's what's happening. Jesus is crucified and the disciples are rightfully devastated, right? They're devastated because maybe this guy that I followed is not the guy that he said he was. Right? Imagine these people thought Jesus had come to save them and he just died. He was killed. Game over, the end. So the disciples are hiding out. They're terrified. They don't know exactly what's going to happen next. But then, days after his death, stories start to pop up. I've seen Jesus. I've seen him. He's over here. And so people are starting to get excited, thinking that Jesus is back. And so Jesus shows up to the disciples, all of the disciples, that is, except Thomas. So when the disciples go back to Thomas, they're like, "Dude, we saw Jesus. He's back." He's pretty skeptical. I think I'd probably be skeptical, and if you were being honest, I think you'd probably be skeptical too, right? Generally, when people die, they stay dead. But then Jesus shows back up. And Jesus shows back up, and this news was so unbelievable that he said, "Look, Thomas said, I'm only going to believe it if Jesus shows up and I put my hands through his nail-pierced hands." Pretty gross, Thomas, but okay. And Jesus shows up, and look, did he get angry at Thomas for not having faith? No. Did he punish Thomas for not believing the news immediately? No. As a matter of fact, Jesus did what Thomas asked. He showed him his scars, and he gave him the evidence that he was looking for. So talk about this for a minute. How do you think you would have reacted if you were Thomas? Have you ever felt like Thomas, unable to fully believe in Jesus, even though other people are totally convinced? And finally, how does it make you feel to hear that God doesn't shame or punish us for asking for evidence before we believe? I'm sure Thomas wasn't the only disciple who needed some evidence to believe in Jesus' resurrection, but he's the only one of the disciples that we know that asked for it. The book of John, where we read about Thomas here in this story, was written about 50 years after Jesus had ascended, after he had left this earth and returned back to heaven. And so the people to whom the book of John was written would be to Christians, to believers that had never physically seen or met Jesus before. Jesus' words to Thomas must have resonated pretty deeply with the people that were originally reading this book. That blessed is those who did not see and yet believed. The story of Thomas here in John 20 is not shameful. As a matter of fact, it's essential. Right? That through Thomas's interaction with Jesus here, we get to see how Jesus responds to believers that need some evidence in order to believe. Although it might be surprising, you can see it in both these stories that we read today. And the main point that I want to get across to you here is that God doesn't shame us for our questions. Instead, God actually gives us the evidence that we need in order to believe. Look, we're all different, right? We're all different. If you ever taken a personality test or even just spent time with a group of people, you can see that we're all different. Some of us are introverted, some of us are extroverted, some of us are leaders, some of us are followers, right? Some of us are relaxed and laid back. Some of us, we want to go skydiving and bungee jumping, right? We're all different, and that's okay. Some of us are more feelings driven. Some of us are more logic and evidence driven. And I think, just taking a guess based off of what we've read today, that Gideon and Thomas are much more on the logic driven side of the scale. They need cold hard facts. They need evidence in order to believe. And listen, God is okay with that. Some of you might believe and interact with and experience God through a very emotional and intuition-driven way. But some of you might say, I need some cold, hard facts. I need some evidence. You might experience and see and interact with God through a logic-driven way, and that's fine. It's okay. Being skeptical, listen, being skeptical isn't a character flaw. It's not a lack of faith. When Gideon and Thomas when they struggled to believe, they simply humbly asked God to show them the evidence, and God provided it. So what about us? Where does that leave us today here in 2020? Does God still provide evidence to us? That's something that I want you to talk about. Take a minute and talk about this. Where do we see evidence of God? Where do we see evidence of God? And what kind of evidence do we have today that would help us believe in the story of Jesus? When we struggle to believe because we're not sure if we have enough evidence or if we have the right evidence, listen, God doesn't shame us for our questions. He doesn't silence us. He doesn't get angry with us. Rather, God shows us the evidence that we need in order to believe. Listen, I hope that you understand that it's okay to have questions and that God doesn't shame you for those questions. In just a few minutes, I'm going to throw on a few more discussion questions for you guys. But remember, God doesn't shame you for your questions. You're not alone. And if you look, He's given you the evidence that you need to believe. God, we're so grateful for you. We're so grateful that you don't shame us for the questions that we have. And God, that you give us the evidence that we need to believe. Lord, help us to seek out those answers, to seek out the evidence that we need to believe. And God, help us and equip us so that we can take the evidence that you've given us to the people around us so that they too can believe in you. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.